I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I really wanted to use that as a title so badly because growing up, one of my favorite songs was I'm Sorry Miss Jackson by Outkast. If anybody remembers how awesome that song was, like that song would put you in a certain mood, bro. When you're with your homies and you're like, man, you could just jam out just to the instrumental and it would still hit so hard. But in today's video, I'm gonna be a little bit more open and ended with you guys about something that I've been thinking about for about a month and a half, ever since Dragon Ball Daima came out. And this is really an open-ended conversation for anybody that feels this way, because I've noticed some people feel this way, some people don't, and I want to get your thoughts. Do you feel like the Dragon Ball community kind of owes Dragon Ball Super an apology? Now, the first thing that you're going to say in reaction to this is, oh, well, Daima's almost a year away, about 10 months if you do the math, so, how can you say anything about Daima when it hasn't even come out yet? Like, we're apologizing for Daima existing when it hasn't even come out, and it might even be better than Dragon Ball Super. But my thing is, looking back at this from a more realistic point of view, I honestly feel, guys, in my heart of hearts, that Dragon Ball Super, when it came out, we just had such serious nostalgia goggles. And I'm going back, and I'm going back to a lot of those episodes. I recently rewatched about 40% of Dragon Ball Super. I'm currently on episode 55. And I just wanted to kind of see what it was like rewatching Super, but strictly with an English dub, because we all basically started with the Japanese dub, especially if you wanted to do reviews on it. So seeing it from, the English perspective was obviously an interesting transition. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys, it really took a lot out of me to get through a lot of these episodes. I mean, my hand was on my head, and I was just staring at the screen with pain and disdain for so many of those early episodes. And I feel, guys, is it the early episodes of Dragon Ball Super that gave it such a horrible reputation? Is Dragon Ball Super actually not as bad as we think it is? I mean, granted, it has its problems. I am not absolving Dragon Ball Super of anything. But do you feel specifically, guys, that the early aspect of Super was so bad that it made people have a different perspective on it? Because the logic is you can't skip 30 something or close to 30 episodes of a show and just say it doesn't matter, just skip to whenever the Universe 6 tournament starts. Because the logic with that, guys, is when I think about the Universe 6 tournament, I honestly feel in my heart of hearts that it wasn't very good. I feel like there were only like two decent fights in it, maybe three. I mean, the Goku hit fight was pretty good. The Vegeta fight against the robot dude, that's how irrelevant he is. He's so relevant. Magetta, I just remember his name as I was recording this, but him, that was a decent fight. But really the fight that really caught my attention, though, would have to be the fight with Vegeta and Kappa, because even though it wasn't a really important fight and it didn't really like break any feats or do anything like really out there, I kind of like that whole dynamic and seeing the transition of Vegeta's character. I feel like the Kappa fight and the Hit fight were really the good ones. I mean, the Vegeta fight against it, he just gets wrecked, so there's not much to really talk about that. And for those who've been following the channel for years, you guys would know that I wasn't the biggest fan of the Piccolo fight against Frost, if you could remember. I had a very strong reaction when that came out. I was not very happy about how that went. But either way, the point I'm trying to get at is that looking at Dragon Ball Super, the first two arcs really brought the whole franchise down. And I feel like it really feels like 30 episodes of torture. I mean, some of those remade episodes were decent. There's like one or two decent episodes of Goku fighting against Beerus. And then, if you go into Resurrection of F, I mean, I'm just going to be honest with you. Resurrection of F is really where it goes down, because there's just nothing there. I mean, it was creative with the whole Captain Ginyu stuff, switching bodies. I thought that was pretty cool, at least to kind of tie all loose ends with Ginyu, because he was a frog for so many years that, like, we really didn't have much to say. But other than the whole Ginyu stuff, and going more into that aspect of things, I feel like the Resurrection of F arc just felt so stretched. And I feel like the primary problem with all of this, guys, is the pacing. Because looking at the pacing for that arc, it was designed originally to be a movie where things were supposed to go a lot faster. So when you take something that people already know and then force them to spend months of their time watching it, because you have to remember, it's not like now where we have all the episodes of Dragon Ball Super so we can, like, you know, click or watch whatever episode we want. Like, when you're watching it live, like, you have to wait an entire week. Like, guys, I want you guys to nod your head or comment in agreement with this, because I'm sure you guys remember this feeling. Like, people who just watch Super now, you could just go episode to episode. It's like years ago when Walking Dead came out, and I got my dad into The Walking Dead many, many years ago, and I remember that it was a very unique experience because he watched it after the initial seasons had already aired, so he can just watch, like, episode to episode a lot easier. But what I was trying to say is that when I was in high school, you know, and when those episodes were airing for the first time, the fascinating thing about it is, you know, when you see, like, the season from, like, when they're in the prison, you know, and prior to that, when they had escaped Herschel's farm and all of that stuff, like, just going episode to episode, like, you just watch the end of season 2 and then you just start season 3, like, that's very different from fans that had to wait an entire year to see the whole, you know, transition where Carl looks older and all of that. And I feel like because of how much we went through, guys, it kind of felt like we went through war together, you know, going through all of those Super episodes in the beginning. I mean, it was a task, but we survived and we got through it. And a lot of those episodes, guys, I'll be brutally honest with you, you know, I didn't have the greatest things to say in reviews because it kind of just felt like I already made my points about the movies, and this episode was a worse animated, slowed down version of what I already saw with some changes. And it's like, well, how could I really give, like, a strong review on something that's already so similar to something I already saw but worse? You know, like, I really feel like Dragon Ball Super got a bad reputation for it, but, you know, as we move on to the other arcs, you know, going into Universe 6 Tournament, I mean, most of the fights were boring, but it wasn't completely terrible. And then when we get to the Zamasu arc, I actually think from the anime perspective, that was the best version of Dragon Ball Super. I feel like the Tournament of Power had greater heights and cooler fights with, like, Goku going Ultra Instinct 4 times. I feel like the fight scenes and the animation was really good in the Tournament of Power. Granted, the story wasn't obviously that good, but it's a tournament, so I'm not going to be so critical on the tournament aspect of it, because, I mean, it's just a big fight. But the Tournament of Power had its issues. I mean, let's be honest, all of Dragon Ball Super has its issues. But I did feel like the fight scenes and the heights that the characters pushed themselves were in Dragon Ball Super was the best in the Tournament of Power. But as the story and my favorite personal arc, because I have bias, because the Android arc is my favorite arc and I like time travel, so I'm obviously going to be biased to the Trunks arc, but also considering the fact that the Trunks Zamasu arc actually had a legit villain, whereas in Dragon Ball Super, Beerus isn't really a villain, he's an antagonist, but he's not really a villain in Battle of Gods. Frieza's a villain, but he's a rehashed villain, which ironically he still is a rehashed villain. And then when you go into Universe 6 Tournament, there are no real villains. I mean, Hit's an assassin, and I guess Frost is a villain, but he's like one of the minor fighters for that universe. You know, so Zamasu fulfilled a feeling that Dragon Ball Super really needed. We needed an original villain that kind of took the show in a different direction, and I think Zamasu did an okay job at that. For Dragon Ball Super standards, I think he was okay. I feel like he kind of has that whole Anakin Skywalker syndrome of he thinks he's the good guy, but he's really not, you know. So I think the Zamasu arc was probably the best arc that Super had in terms of the anime. However, when we go on to the manga, I think it was complete garbage. I think that, and that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about Dragon Ball Super, that the arc that I think is the best in the anime is the arc that I think is the worst in the manga. But guys, I'm telling you, man, whew, if you go back and watch, or shall I say read, the manga version of the Zamasu arc, it is not pretty. I mean, Toyotaro was pulling every creative, like, I mean, that was too creative. Like, in that arc, it literally just felt like Toyotaro had no idea what direction he was going in and was just coming up with ideas and breaking old rules and creating no rules and just completely changing the entire fabric of the arc chapter by chapter, where some chapters Goku can do a Hakai, and then they fuse one chapter, and then Trunks can heal. I mean, they were coming up with so many different things in all of this. I like that Trunks and the Supreme Kai had kind of like a backstory and all of that, but man, the Zamasu arc is garbage in the manga, guys. I'm telling you, it is straight terrible. You know, and when we go on from there, I mean, I honestly feel like the best overall arc in Dragon Ball Super would probably have to be the Mora arc. I'm going to do a video going deeper into this because obviously you didn't click on this video to hear me talk about the Mora arc, but I mean, I have a very strong opinion on the Mora arc. It has its issues just like every arc, but I think relative to other arcs that we've seen, I feel like the Mora arc is definitely the strongest because it feels like the most traditional Dragon Ball arc where the characters train, they have a unique villain, you know, all the other characters have involvement. It felt like a grandiose arc, and it actually had a villain, which, well, like I said before, is something that Dragon Ball lacks, you know. Broly, the Broly movie, I mean, Broly's an antagonist, but he's not really a villain because he's just losing his mind because he's super pissed off and his form helps him lose control, very similar to Kale. It's like one of those things where Super still hasn't learned that villains are what really drive Dragon Ball, and while you can have tournament arcs and tournament arcs are fun, the fabric of the show is to see good guys versus bad guys. It's as simple as that, and I feel like, you know, that's why the Zamasu arc in the anime was the best, in my opinion, because I felt like that was the closest to a decent-ish traditional Dragon Ball arc. And while it had its issues of Trunks just pulling out, you know, a spirit sword out of nowhere and just cutting the main villain in half, only for the main villain to basically turn into a ghost and still exist even more. I mean, like I said, there were its crazy moments, you know, but overall, and, you know, Trunks figuring out how to do the Mafuba by watching Piccolo do it on his cell phone. I mean, there's some stupid things there, but ultimately I felt like that was the best, and the Moro arc is the best of the manga. And as far as the Granola arc is concerned, or the gas, whatever you want to call it, I feel like the best parts of the arc were actually in the beginning, where Granola comes in and fights Goku and Vegeta. That was really fun, and then the gas fights were cool. But I just feel like the arc didn't really know where it was going, where it seemed like Alec had a lot bigger intentions, you know, and the whole backstory with Bardock and all of that just felt like really forced. And I already talked about this in a previous video, how like when you start touching characters from the past, you know, you're always taking like a serious risk of like screwing up future events because the past is set in stone, so when you start trying to change the past or add this, you're creating like bigger issues for the future directly. And I feel like this is something that Dragon Ball's been doing since Minus, and while it has its merits in certain areas, like expanding the series with introducing, you know, GNA and all that stuff, I feel like on another hand it could be really weak. But ultimately though, guys, you know, when we arrive where we are now with, you know, the superhero arc in the manga, I mean, the honest truth is that it's kind of ironically like the opposite of what we had with the Dragon Ball anime, where technically the manga is ahead now, and we already saw this in movie form or animated form, but now we're getting it in manga form, which is kind of weird. Like, you pretty much never see that, but ultimately, I mean, I feel like the Goten and Trunks parts were okay. The rest, I mean, honestly, it's just like I just don't have too much to say about it because it's just slightly different from what we've already seen. And I feel like because the manga comes out even slower than anime, because at least you get like one episode. I mean, sometimes there were hiatuses, but at least you can get a new episode every week. I mean, now you gotta wait an entire month just to get one new chapter. And then sometimes they don't even give you a chapter for a month, so this arc has felt so slow, and nobody is talking about it because nobody cares, because we've already seen and watched this. You know, it's just like, you know, but ultimately I feel like the big point of this video, and I'm sorry Dragon Ball Super, is just to kind of talk about Daima, because, you know, we haven't seen Daima yet, and I'm going to give it a chance, and I'll be honest, Dragon Ball Daima looks fantastic, it really does, but at least in the premise of feeling like a traditional Dragon Ball show, I feel like Dragon Ball Super was closer to OG Dragon Ball than what Daima is at least attempting to do. Granted, we don't know the full extent of the plot yet, but just from the outset, this doesn't even feel like Dragon Ball. I'm just being honest with you. I mean, you could say GT did, but GT did also feel traditional at certain points. You know, I mean, the whole trip to space was traditional in its elements of trying to replicate the original Dragon Ball, where Goku went on an adventure with Bulma. They just kind of changed the dynamics where Trunks is the brain and Pan is the damsel in distress, whereas Bulma was basically both of those two characters in one, and Goku was the muscle. And then obviously there's Oolong, who was there for comic relief, and then Master Roshi and the other characters that they made along the way. But ultimately, though, I feel like GT felt a lot more traditional the more the series went past that whole Black Star Dragon Ball hunt, ultimately. You know, and, you know, just to be honest with you guys, I mean, my honest opinion of Dragon Ball Super is that it had a lot of cool concepts for certain things and forms and transformations. And I'll say that, like, Dragon Ball Super has even better transformations than what we've had in Z. I mean, I feel like Ultra Instinct and Ultra Ego are so cool in not only how they look, but specifically of how they are tailor-made for the characters that are using them, you know. And in a lot of ways, this kind of reminds me a lot of Digimon Season 4 for anybody who remembers, you know. Digimon Season 4, I mean, I'm going to simplify for people who don't know, but basically at a certain point, Takuya and Koji were like the main characters, and in the earlier aspects of the show, the other characters were more relevant, but Takuya and Koji kind of like developed in their own direction, and like they were really like the only main characters, and the other characters were kind of fodder at that point. And it kind of feels like that for Goku and Vegeta, but the better thing about Dragon Ball is that the other characters still have more relevance with Gohan and Piccolo, and now Broly, who's ironically a good guy now. And you know, since Broly's an ally, I only feel like the Z team, I guess you could say, is a lot stronger than ever, you know. And as a result of that, and also consider the fact that I remember it was Koji had like a brother, and if I remember correctly, like his brother was also one of the stronger characters too. I remember his brother had like a black wolf form or something like that, and somebody in the comment section is going to remind me, but I remember it was Takuya, Koji, and Koji's brother, who like came later on in the series. It's been so long since I've seen Digimon Season 4. I mean, we're talking, I was like maybe 7 or 8. So like my memory is in a fog, and it's not a show that I went back and rewatched, but I feel like because of the transformation, because it felt like more original Dragon Ball, yeah, the animation was garbage, you know, and all of that, but I do feel like Dragon Ball fans would feel a lot more satisfied with Super coming back. And that's not to say that Super is absolved. Like, once again, let me make this crystal clear. I'm not absolving Dragon Ball Super for all of its problems. I'm just saying that when you start seeing something else come out, you appreciate what you used to have. You know, and that's a lesson about life. And I'm going to end this video talking about this, because I know I've talked a little bit longer than I usually do. But I kind of just really wanted to just talk in today's video and kind of just, you know, clear the air on some things. But ultimately, guys, my opinion is this. As I've gotten older, I've learned that you don't appreciate what you have in the moment until you see what you have in the future. You're like, damn, I don't realize that those were the good days until the bad days come. You know, that's one of the horrible lessons that we as humans learn about life. We don't realize we're living in the good times until the bad times come. You know, and that's also a good thing too, because when you're living in the bad times, you will appreciate when you have good times after the bad times end. You know, I feel like that's another thing about it too, and you know, I'm not even just talking about with Dragon Ball or YouTube or anything. I'm talking about with personal things in my life. I'm sure many of you guys could agree that there were other aspects of your life where you've gone through things like this way beyond YouTube, anime, any of that stuff, and you know, you learn to appreciate things more. And even though Super had its issues, and I would criticize it just as much as I did back then, I do feel like with the ultra soft direction that not just Super but censorship and the way that the world is turning into, man, I'm not gonna lie to you, man, it just feels like the days of those glory 1990s, early 2000s gore and blood, like those days are looking real far behind. And at least as far as Dragon Ball is concerned. That's not to say that there aren't other anime, you know, like Chainsaw Man or Jujutsu Kaisen that exist that fill in that gap. But for traditional shonen, man, it just feels like everything's been getting a lot more soft. So ultimately, that's my take, guys. These has been 20 minutes of me talking about, I'm sorry, Dragon Ball Super, and saying that there were some good with the bad, and I feel like we didn't appreciate some aspects of Super when we are seeing what we're going to get with Daima.